Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive interviews with leading experts every weekday here on Al Arabiya News. I'm Tom Burges Watson. Coming up on today's programme, President Putin signals willingness to hold direct talks with Ukraine and sees President Zelensky following suit. We ask, what's at stake ahead of peace talks hosted by Kyiv's allies in London tomorrow? Plus, we look back at the life of the Pope Francis, who has passed away yesterday at the age of 88. We ask, what's next for the Vatican? Hello and welcome to the programme. We're going to begin with the war in Ukraine, which has been raging now for more than 1,100 days. Some analysts are now saying that Russia could finally be ready to discuss an end to this conflict. This after the Russian President Vladimir Putin said that he looked positively on peace initiatives and signalled that Kyiv could follow suit. Well, it's the first time that Russia has suggested the possibility of direct talks since the early days of the all-out war, which began in 2022. Well, let's get more on this now with the former head of the British Army and the former Chief of the General Staff, General the Lord Richard Dunatt. Thank you very much indeed for speaking to us, Lord Dunatt. Always a pleasure. Just want to ask you, first of all, we're hearing from the Russian president saying that there is this potential for direct talks now between him and the Ukrainian leadership, we presume. Does that sound promising to you?
Well, I think any offer of talks is promising. I think President Zelensky has said previously that he is willing to have talks. So if the Kremlin is now saying that they're willing to enter talks, then that has to be a positive sign. Of course, the question is, what are they going to talk about? And what are the terms and conditions that particularly the Kremlin wants to put on the table?
And just in terms of, the other latest developments of the last couple of days, I mean, there was this Easter truce. And I'm wondering if you think that was a positive step, or as some people would argue, a bit of a marketing gimmick.
Well, it doesn't seem to have been a huge success. Taken at face value, it seemed like a reasonable thing to suggest at an important time in the annual calendar, namely Easter. But it would appear that it has been characterized by many ceasefire violations, and therefore it probably should be regarded as something of a marketing gimmick and something that didn't really have much substance to it. You could actually be rather more malign about it and say that it was something that the Kremlin suggested and then would criticize Kyiv and the Ukrainians for breaking. In other words, putting the Russians, in their eyes, certainly on the moral high ground. So I think one shouldn't attach too much to this apparent 30-hour ceasefire. What is more interesting is to see whether there is some substance to a potential dialogue between the Kremlin and Kyiv now.
One of the things we've seen since President Trump returned to the White House is a flurry of diplomatic activity. And I'm wondering if you think there is anything to show for that nearly 100 days of diplomatic action. Any progress in your view, sir?
Well, I think one has to be honest and say that I don't think there is much realistic progress. If anything, there are some rather worrying developments of a negative nature as far as Ukraine is concerned. Donald Trump has talked about the need, in his view, for the Americans to switch their focus away from Europe, much more to focus on the Indo-Pacific and their challenge from China. So that is a significant factor. I think in the early exchanges by Donald Trump and his spokesman, quite a lot was given away. Quite a lot was given away in the context of any ceasefire would be along the lines of the current status quo on the ground. In other words, Russian troops occupying some 20% of Ukrainian sovereign territory would be allowed to stay there, and also giving up for a very long time the notion of Ukraine joining NATO. So these are rather negative issues as far as Ukraine is concerned. And then, of course, remember that there was a short period when the United States, in order to make the point, stopped providing intelligence and information to the Ukrainian armed forces, which actually played out very negatively, albeit for a short while, on the battlefield. So what really has been happening over the period that Donald Trump came into power is not very encouraging from Ukraine's point of view.
Why do you think President Trump views this conflict so differently from how his predecessor viewed it, and also how pretty much the rest, with one or two exceptions, of the collective West views this conflict?
Well, I think we have to look at the character of Donald Trump. He likes to characterize himself as being a businessman, as someone who can make deals, and he's got quite a track record of doing that. He tried to make a deal with North Korea. Not much actually came out of that. He did make a deal with the Taliban with disastrous consequences. So on this occasion, he thought that he could probably strike up a relationship with Vladimir Putin and strike a deal with him to end the war. Well, it turns out that this is not the case. However, there is one deal that very much interests Donald Trump, and that's trying to persuade the Ukrainians to sign away their rare earth minerals. So what we're seeing is Donald Trump, the deal maker, trying to live up to his own reputation, but frankly, with pretty disastrous consequences so far for Ukraine and more widely for the collective security of Europe, which of course is where countries like the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Poland, the Baltic states, Finland, Sweden, have a very, very well-developed interest.
Ukraine's allies are going to meet in London tomorrow, and I'm wondering if you see that and the involvement of the United States in those talks as perhaps being an indication that there is a little bit more coordination now that we're approaching the 100-day mark of the Trump presidency, coordination between the Americans and their European allies.
Well, I think that's encouraging. Again, rather like the early part of the conversation that you and I are having, it all depends what the agenda is and what the discussion items are that are on the table. But certainly it is positive that the United States, United Kingdom, France, Germany, Ukraine are sitting down together and trying to formulate, I assume, a common negotiating position, which, if the Kremlin is offering talks, then at least there is an agreed Western and Ukrainian position that can be put on the table and form the basis of an agenda for a discussion with the Kremlin. But there's an awful lot of ifing and butting in what I'm saying, to be absolutely frank.
I mean, the British Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, I don't know what your assessment has been of his handling of this, because he's obviously he's walking something of a tightrope between Brussels and Washington. He's also volunteered British forces as part of a future peacekeeping force in Ukraine. Do you see a role like that for the United Kingdom?
Well, it's an interesting question. It's an important question, but I'm afraid it currently is a rather hypothetical question. I think it's hypothetical because we haven't got the basis of a ceasefire. We haven't got the basis of a peace agreement. And without a basis for either of those, it's very difficult to know on what further basis you can then orchestrate a procedure whereby the ceasefire, if that's what is decided, can be monitored. Now, there's all kinds of options where that is possible, some of which are extraordinarily unlikely, and all of which, of course, are subject to Vladimir Putin saying that he will not tolerate Western or NATO troops in Ukraine. So Keir Starmer, who I agree, is trying to tread a very fine line between relations between London and Washington and relations between London and Brussels, of course, bearing in mind that Kyiv comes into it as well. He said that he was ready and willing to put British troops on the ground. Well, he might be ready and willing, but frankly, the British military isn't really ready to do that. And judging by the response from most other Western capitals, I'm not sure that they are either. So we are building a hypothetical question on a hypothetical situation. We need to see more evidence of a ceasefire plan before it can then be determined how that's going to be monitored.
OK, well, let's look at numbers instead then. And you're quoted in the British press as suggesting that not enough is being spent on defence of the United Kingdom. I think you're quoted as saying that 2.5% of British GDP should be spent on defence. I mean, is that enough? And are you seeing signs that this relatively new government in the United Kingdom is taking steps to address that?
Well, it's encouraging on the one hand that the relatively new government, as you describe it, in the United Kingdom has realised that we have got to spend more on defence, and that 2.3% of GDP is insufficient, bearing in mind in the days of the Cold War, we were spending 5% of GDP on defence, with the result that that deterred Soviet aggression, and that Cold War never turned hot. Now, the government has said that it wants to raise spending to 3% at some point in the future, perhaps towards the end of the decade. Well, that is also encouraging. But frankly, the issue is a here and now issue. You have to ask why Germany is now significantly increasing its defence spending, why Poland already has, why the Baltic states already have. And the United Kingdom, although it may have financial pressures of its own, frankly, if it wants to be taken seriously and wants to make a real difference, both to our own national security, European collective security, and our contribution to Ukraine, must decide very soon to increase to 3%, or indeed even as far as 3.5% of GDP to be spent on defence, and as soon as possible.
One thing we've heard from the British Foreign Secretary David Lammy is that he says President Putin wants to, quote, recreate the Russian Empire and suffocate the countries around its border. I wonder if you share that assessment, and really sort of to summarise everything, how dangerous a juncture do you think Europe is at right now?
Well, I think we have to examine Vladimir Putin's speeches, Vladimir Putin's writings, to gain a good understanding of what he really wants to do. We have to remember also, scrape him to the core, and you've got an unreconstructed KGB colonel whose beloved Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact military forces disintegrated at the end of the 1980s as a result of the cohesion of the West at the end of the Cold War. He would love nothing more than to recreate some of the influence of the heart of the old Soviet Union, in other words, Russia, into a greater Russia. And the first stage of that is to expand Russian influence into Ukraine. And remember that Ukraine, when translated, effectively means borderlands. Borderlands of what? Well, Putin would see the borderlands of Russia. So we have got a well-documented and a well-stated intention that he wants to expand the Russian influence. But the question of really how you go about it. The rules-based world order that's been in existence certainly since the end of the Cold War and really since the end of the Second World War does not stand for aggression into the sovereign territory of a neighbouring state. And that's exactly what he's done as far as Ukraine is concerned. So it's not surprising that decent-minded other states, like the United States, like the United Kingdom, France, Germany and Poland, are all standing with Ukraine to say, no, this is unacceptable.
Just lastly, Lord Dunatt, to wrap up our conversation, are you optimistic that out of all of this will emerge an independent Ukraine?
It would be a disaster if Ukraine was to be subordinated to Russia. It would be a disaster for the rules-based organization that I was just talking about. Now, this war has got to come to an end at some point. I would like to see it come to an end sooner rather than later because too many people are dying and too much infrastructure is being damaged. But on what basis it's going to end is very difficult to see. The nearest example I can think of and can quote is really how the Korean War came to an end in 1953. It started with aggression, a lot of fighting, 3 million people lost their lives. It stopped with a ceasefire agreement. There's been no peace settlement. And this comes back to an earlier part of our conversation. To maintain the freedom, if you like, of South Korea, the United States has had to underwrite that. And there are more than 25,000 United States troops in South Korea today. Now, if we're going to do the same after a ceasefire in Ukraine, are we serious about putting a large number of European troops, notwithstanding Putin's objection to that, into a sovereign Ukraine? All these are really important questions, and we're nowhere near an answer at the present moment.
OK, well, thank you very much indeed for your time. It's been a pleasure speaking to you, General the Lord Richard Dunatt. Thank you so much again.
Thank you.
Well, for more, we're joined by Ambassador Thomas Pickering, former US ambassador to Russia. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. We've been hearing from President Putin saying that, yes, indeed, there were multiple violations during the Easter truce. But, he says, the Russians are ready for direct talks. Does that sound promising to you?
It does sound promising. I heard it last night and thought that this was something of a break. It is surrounded by uncertainties, including the fact that the Easter 30-day truce broke down on apparently both sides, as well as the fact that the American Secretary of State says if the talks don't move, we may move on, which is a threat of some kind that may well have sparked President Putin's response, or in fact, it may not have at all. We're still waiting to kind of see how the pieces fit together in this and whether there is a next step of real talks. There'll be meetings in London next week with Europeans. There'll be, we think, some meetings between the American negotiator and or President Putin to see whether that moves out. And the real question for us is, will there be a Putin-Zelensky meeting? And if so, how will that work out? None of that, in my view, is chiseled in stone, so to speak. It's all part of what is a dynamic here, which indicates the Russians may be more interested than they have been. President Zelensky has certainly changed from his unwillingness some months ago to move without certain assurances, now to move on the basis that he will have an opportunity to talk directly with the Russian side.
Okay, you've raised lots of important points there. I mean, let's pick up on the point you made about this threat from President Trump that the Americans could walk away from this whole process if patience really does run as thin as it looks like it's running. I mean, who stands to lose more in the event that the Americans just say, we're done with this, leave it to you? The Russians or the Ukrainians?
I think that both sides stand to lose, given the fact that the Russians seem to be in a more forward military position, but far from a perfect answer to their goals. They may, in this particular case, have a little bit less to lose, which is why I think international attention has turned to President Putin's statements, which seem to be what I would call a swerve in the Russian steady path that they want to win this militarily, and the talks are a way designed to achieve that, but they have no flexibility. This is not flexibility in substance, but flexibility in process for diplomats usually precedes flexibility in substance.
I mean, what's the incentive for the Russians to hold talks at this particular moment? I mean, that's the Trump desired outcome, because he set himself this target of achieving peace within 24 hours or possibly within 100 days of assuming the presidency. But why should that suit the Russians? And what's their incentive to stop the fighting now, especially if they have the upper hand?
It's an important question, Tom. It gives them an opportunity to exploit what has been President Trump's indication that he was prepared to support them in acquiring the territory they have already captured and not seeking to support Ukraine in seeking the return of that territory, eastern Ukraine and Crimea. And that would be not a perfect victory for Putin, but a way to stop the loss of personnel, which I think is beginning to show some substantive irritations, if we could cause it that way, in Russian public confidence that President Putin's now 3-year war is a howling success. And it would allow Putin to say he's gained a great deal, particularly territorially and maybe politically, to do that and begin to stifle some of the loss in public confidence around the world that he suffered. He's quite isolated. And finally, allow him to claim enough of a victory to continue to, in effect, be able to dominate the Russian political scene, something were he not able to do might well lead him into a process of public confidence being well enough undermined to lose his position. And he and others who are in similar positions around the world have relied very heavily on wins in war to retain their public position, which gives them at least some guarantee of immunity against being put in jail by their publics.
One other thing we've been hearing from the Kremlin, they're warning against rushing the Ukraine peace talks. I mean, do you think that's how they feel? Do you think they feel like they're being rushed by the United States and indeed the United States' Western allies?
It may be in part how and in what way they make it clear that they're going to seek a significantly high price in the peace talks to justify their engaging in them rather than to continue the military conflict, which has been their strategy up until now.
We're coming up to the 100-day anniversary of President Trump returning to the White House. I mean, when you look back on these last 90, however many days it's been, I mean, how much progress, what achievements do you think can be attributed to the Trump administration in this regard?
This is a very difficult question to assess, in part because most of these steps that President Trump and his team have taken are under judicial pressures, if I could put it this way, suits and decisions by senior courts in the United States that have certainly frozen what they're doing, and some have even ordered undoing of what they have been doing, mostly in the domestic context, including the deportation of immigrants to Central America, and other important questions for President Trump in light of the popularity he seeks to inspire, if we could put it this way, by handling the immigrant problem as he did in the electoral outcome, in which he attributes a good bit of his imputed success to dealing with immigration in a harsh, firm, and finalized manner.
Okay, I mean, do you think President Trump is right to be trying to build ties with the Kremlin and with specifically the Russian president?
He seems to believe that this will be important to bring about a peace settlement. He does seem to be generally impressed by the idea that a peace settlement can redound to his popularity and advantage internationally, something that in the first 100 days since the election has been under, if I can be carefully diplomatic, under serious strain. There has not been a large garnering of international support, some dropping away and some criticism and some uncertainty, particularly as our European friends and allies will know. And so the ability to recover, if we could put it this way, some of the directing leadership for international activities of significance would be important for him, even if that ended up in getting the half of the loaf that he has sought to gain at the beginning. The 24 hours, I'll solve the problem of Ukraine, is obviously well gone. 100 days is not 24 hours.
But there's a danger, isn't it, that, you know, this is a rush deal and it's not necessarily the best deal and it's not a lasting deal. I mean, history's not going to look back too kindly on this. And there will also be those who say that basically capitulating to most of the Russian demands, no NATO membership for Ukraine ever, handing over those 4 regions that are disputed. I mean, there isn't an awful lot of difference between that and outright surrender, is there?
Well, there is, if, Tom, you go back to the notion that when he started, it was we'll occupy Kyiv in 24 hours, then we'll roll on. And there were many of us who were concerned that rolling on meant going beyond Ukraine, either into Poland, which would have certainly sparked Article 5 of NATO, or to Moldova, which is not linked to any defense system, and rolling over that particularly small but important territory in which, as we know from history, Russian military presence is still significantly important. So there is a difference between settling now and settling for what were assumed to be in February 2022 his most expansive ambitions in terms of territory, at least, and territory seemingly coupled with international leadership influence. And therefore, one could see it as some reduction of demand. But President Zelensky, on the other hand, would have suffered as well some kind of a backlog in not being able to recover Crimea, the four eastern oblasts, and perhaps certainly being forced out of Kursk Oblast in Russia, where some Ukrainian forces still persist in military activity.
I mean, it's sometimes said by analysts that President Putin, ever since he first came to power in the year 2000, has been pretty much focused on rebuilding what he sees as Russia's rightful empire, the Soviet Union, and the loss of that he's characterized as being a massive humiliation. I mean, do you think this is really what he's trying to achieve? Do you, as someone who knows Russia well, think that President Putin's desired outcome is simply to turn back the tide on what happened in the late 1980s and early 1990s?
I think that some of that is certainly there. The really interesting question is how much he is dominated by the notion that were he not to succeed and not to be able to claim success, this would endanger his continued leadership in Russia, and therefore put him in a position of one way or another being forced out. And the consequences of that might not be very pleasant in terms of how that happens in places where dictatorship seems to fail to be able to establish its permanent presence, if I could phrase it that way.
And just pivoting back to, the U.S. perspective on this conflict, we heard Marco Rubio, the U.S. Secretary of State, saying that patience is wearing thin. He didn't say patience with whom, though. What's your interpretation? Do you think he's more impatient with the Ukrainians or with the Russians?
Well, it's interesting because that, I think, is still up for decision. It has a question mark over it. Certainly, President Putin's statements on this Easter weekend and the proposal for a 30-hour Easter truce from the Russians indicates that it may well be connected in some way or another with Secretary of State Rubio's statement about patience is not an eternal virtue with the United States, and we may move on. Zelensky, in many ways, President Zelensky has more to lose in this. He has less territory now than he had in February. He has clearly established that he is the victim of aggression, at least in a very broad way in the international community. And therefore, the notion that victims of aggression do not succeed in self-defense under a situation in which equity, justice, fairness, freedom, democracy are seemingly still important international goals for the largest majority of nations in the international community, certainly in the United Nations, would seem to be a real setback that people should be concerned about, not just in terms of U.S. perpetuation of Trump's presidency and success there. We do know that apparently U.S. Representative Steve Witkoff has begun to share what real estate people call a term sheet with the Europeans and with others who are at least potentially important U.S. and Ukrainian allies that may well, from its name and character, lay out the goals that the U.S. believes should be achievable in the negotiating process on which we may be about to embark, about which there's some serious uncertainty, as you have seen in our conversation and the discussions we've had. So those are all things that I think are very much to be kept in mind in this very uncertain situation, which is evolving, which has shown some potential for positive signs, but many question marks. And beyond that, will there be a peace to follow ceasefire, to accompany ceasefire? Will there be the guarantees that President Zelensky hopes to have in terms of the fact that the ceasefire will not be just a stopping point for Russian rearmament, rebuilding, and reassertion of military force, but something that has a permanent characteristic with it. And that permanent characteristic can be something in which he and the Ukrainians can have confidence, given the support that they would have from the international community and certainly Europe and NATO. All of those remain out there to be settled in this very, very important diplomatic process. So we can say we're seeing the signs of the beginning of change, but we have been through that now for quite some time, since 2022, sure. A significant number of ceasefires, and none of them has held yet. So the record is, put it this way, creating serious doubts until we see much more capacity on the field of substance and action to perform in ways that show us real progress.
Okay, I mean, do you think this basically boils down to the fact that, there is a growing realization in Washington that it's not quite as simple as picking up the telephone and ending this war in one simple conversation? This is a highly complex conflict with many moving parts, and it's going to take time and patience.
Well, there was grave doubts when the 24-hour solution was touted that indeed it had any sense of reality connected to it. Now, 100 days in, that particular set of doubts is now, I think, reinforced for most people who follow this situation fairly closely. One should not, however, sell short totally the fact that no progress has been made. If President Putin has now moved from no negotiations and complete military victory to part of a process that has negotiations involved, from something that in one way or another seems to be a need for ceasefires, either to rebuild, reboot, rearm, or preserve human life, at least in those areas of the world for which he has responsibility. That may give us a little bit of an indication that we need to pursue this very, very carefully, and that this has not yet the quality of an open door, but it has the quality of a door that might be able to be swung open.
Okay, well, we're going to leave it there. We're out of time. Thank you very much indeed for speaking to us.
Thank you, Tom, very much. Delight to be with you.
Thank you very much indeed.
Sure.
We're going to turn our attention now to the life of Pope Francis, who has been called an energetic revolutionary and a reforming outlier in the history of conservative heads of the Catholic Church. Well, the pontiff was 88 when he passed away early on Monday morning after a bout of medical issues. Well, tributes are continuing to pour in as the Pope lies in state at the chapel of his Santa Marta residence. Well, world leaders, including President Donald Trump, President Volodymyr Zelensky, and the French leader Emmanuel Macron, are going to attend a funeral service on Saturday in front of the St. Peter's Basilica. Meanwhile, flags across the world are flying at half-mast as dozens of countries declare national mourning. Well, after Pope Francis is laid to rest, the world will then turn its attention to electing the next leader of the Catholic Church, raising concerns over losing the progressive streak that the late pontiff brought to the Church. Well, an intense conclave will take place within the walls of the Sistine Chapel, begging the question, will the next pope be an anti-Francis force, or will the deciding 135 cardinals continue in the path laid by the late pontiff? Well, let's get more now, and we can speak to Candida Moss, who is the author of God's Ghostwriters and Cadbury Professor of Theology at the University of Birmingham. Thank you very much indeed for speaking to us, Professor Moss. Some people describing the late Pope Francis as caring, others using words like down to earth. What would be your way of describing the late Pope?
I think when we think about Pope Francis, what comes to mind is a man of great compassion and empathy, a man of the people, and someone who always went above and beyond to be in touch with the people from all walks of life, be they prisoners, as we saw just last week, or children, or people with disabilities. And I think when people remember Pope Francis, that is what they think of.
I mean, he was working right until the end, wasn't he? His last function was on Easter Sunday, and he died the following morning. Was he something of a workaholic?
This has been said about him. When he was hospitalized for 5 weeks in February and March, he was working from his hospital bed. He was often said to be sitting in an armchair working. He was issuing directives. He was talking to cardinals about upcoming canonizations. And certainly when it comes to Easter, which is the high point of the Catholic liturgical year, this was an important event for him to participate in, but he still prioritized. He prioritized meeting with people. He prioritized visiting prisoners, and he prioritized liturgy and the Catholic laity over more politicized meetings, such as that with Vice President Vance.
Indeed, and lots of reaction from all across the world. Most world leaders you can think of have given some kind tributes to the late Pope. Some people say he charmed the world. I don't know if you agree with that. How do you think he did that?
Well, he was a man of great personal charisma, and it's very hard to be critical of Francis the man because he really walked the walk. I think when people think of Pope Francis, and this was really what the Catholic Church needed at the time, he was a moral authority. He was someone whose behavior meant that he could act as a conscience for Christians worldwide, regardless of whether or not they were Catholic, because he had kind of thrown off the kind of trappings and pomp and circumstance of the Vatican in favor of the kind of down-to-earth mission and pastoral day-to-day work. So he may have charmed people with his personal charisma, but he did also take bold steps to try and reform the Catholic Church and to modernize in certain respects, both by reaching out to LGBT Catholics, divorced, remarried Catholics, and members of other religious groups. He was known for talking about how members of other religious groups could also go to heaven and how even non-believers and atheists would find salvation eventually.
So it sounds like you're saying he really changed the institution.
Well, he tried to, but the Catholic Church moves very slowly at a glacial pace. So what he changed was really the tone of the church, where people have been critical as they have said, well, he changed the tone, but not the lyrics. Many of his reforms weren't sort of ushered into kind of official church teaching or canon law. They were instead off the cuff or ad hoc remarks that Pope Francis himself made to individuals. They weren't sort of formal ex cathedra statements that changed church teaching.
But you're making it sound like he made it much more inclusive as an institution, or at least it made it sound like it was more inclusive as an institution.
Definitely. Pope Francis did make the church more inclusive. He was welcoming people in and accepting those that the church had previously sort of excluded, particularly Catholics who had felt excluded beforehand. But I think the question here is Pope Francis was welcoming. Pope Francis wanted to invite everyone in, but he didn't invite everyone in ways that have sort of lasting permanence in the Catholic Church. And in terms of his legacy and his desire to have a more welcoming church, that will be seen in the actions of his successor, whoever that is.
Indeed, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. But let's just finish off with Pope Francis. According to an opinion poll where you are in the United States, 75% of US Catholics viewed Pope Francis favourably last year. But that's down from about 90% in 2015. And I just wonder why you think it is that during the course of a decade, about 15% of US Catholics took a less favourable view of the Pope.
Well, I think his initial high performance rating was based on just personal charisma and all the things you saw him doing. He really was sort of embodying Christian values. But in the last few years in the Catholic Church, particularly in America, there has been a spike in conservative Catholics. More Roman Catholics, particularly young Roman Catholics, are embracing much more traditional forms of Catholicism, including Latin Mass and adoration, which these are practices that we associate with pre-Vatican II in the 1950s. And with that spike in conservative Catholics, we see more people who are critical of Pope Francis and who are opposed to his reforms and efforts to make the church more inclusive.
And when it comes to politics, obviously Pope Francis met J.D. Vance, the US Vice President, only a couple of days ago. Do you think it's fair to say that on occasion it sounded a bit like he was sparring with President Trump? For example, he talked about plans to deport migrants, calling that a disgrace. He also expressed unease about cuts to foreign aid and domestic welfare programs. I mean, do you think it's fair to say there was a clash of cultures really there?
Absolutely. I think that when it came to Pope Francis and everything that he stood for, his focus on the poor, the vulnerable, and immigrants, all of which are solid, ancient Catholic teachings that go back as far as we have records, that Pope Francis and President Trump were quite strongly opposed to one another. And that goes back to the beginning of Pope Francis's time as Pope. He criticized Donald Trump back when he was talking about building a border wall, for example. And so I think what we see in Pope Francis is a man who sees that it was his responsibility, his moral responsibility to speak truth to power, particularly to powerful and wealthy nations, whom Pope Francis saw as having a moral obligation to help immigrants and the poor.
And in terms of who replaces Pope Francis, I mean, obviously lots of names are out there. I mean, there's a large number of cardinals, and we couldn't possibly name all of them, but there are some American cardinals, and some people saying one or two of them, notably the Cardinal Joseph Tobin of Newark, Archbishop Robert McElroy of Washington, Cardinal Blaise of Chicago. I mean, there's some of the names that are being bandied around in the press. I don't know if any of those names mean anything to you and whether you think the next Pope could be an American, because that would be a first, wouldn't it?
It would be a first. And I have to say, these are three very different men. So the Cardinal from Washington, D.C. would be very much a kind of Francis Bergoglian Pope, if appointed. He has been very vocal on issues of immigration, whereas Cardinal Tobin is more conservative. In terms of could we have an American Pope? Theoretically, of course we could. I think the interesting question is whether or not the College of Cardinals, which is now more global than it has ever been, thanks to Pope Francis, and has much higher percentages of representatives from South America, Africa, and Asia, will want to see power in an American Pope just as a matter of principle. There's a very powerful and, shall we say, fierce American president right now. And will the rest of the world's cardinals, who probably will have felt strongly about President Trump's comments about their home countries, about his position on immigration, and of course the cutting of programs like USAID, will they want to have an American Pope at the same time as this president? If you couple that with the sex abuse scandals that plague the American church, I think it's highly unlikely that we could see an American cardinal.
Okay, so what do you think is a more likely scenario? I mean, are there any front runners out there? Do you think that's a likely next Pope?
There definitely are. There's a handful, and it depends on where they come down on these issues, more conservative or a more Francis-type leader. We might see Pietro Parolin, who is the Vatican Secretary of State and kind of a consummate diplomat. He is the person who met with J.D. Vance on immigration. He could easily become the next pope. If we were thinking more progressive, perhaps Matteo Zuppi, who is from Bologna, who has been very vocal on issues related to poverty, but also supportive of LGBT rights. For conservatives, we might see our first African pope in 1500 years, probably in Cardinal Bazungo Abongo from the Congo, who is perhaps the most powerful African cardinal right now. And we also might see our first Asian pope, and that would be Luis Tagle from the Philippines, who people were talking about as a potential pope back in 2013, and who, as a sort of moderate, more central figure, might be able to win votes from both conservatives and liberals. Whomever is elected, though, has to win the favor of cardinals from around the world. It is no longer the case that one can be elected pope merely by currying favor with Europeans and North Americans.
Yeah, certainly. It's a much more international body of people, isn't it? Just lastly, I mean, do you think the legacy of Pope Francis has really determined, in a way, and changed who the next pope will be?
Well, the future of his legacy lies in the hands of his successor. But I think one part of his legacy, which is important, is the shift in tone. Francis, unlike his predecessor, he has grounded his authority not just in his status as Pope, as leader of Roman Catholics around the world, but in his personal conduct and behavior. People looked to him as a moral authority because they liked him and they believed that he was authentically a good person. And I think it would be very hard for Pope Francis's successor to immediately don papal ermine and the papal tiara again and assume all of the trappings of the papacy without also looking to follow in Pope Francis's footsteps as a man of the people.
Okay, well, it's been a real pleasure talking to you. We really appreciate you taking the time to join us here on Al Arabiya News. Candida Moss, thank you very much indeed.
Thanks for having me.
We can talk more now about the late Pope and who might replace him with Ruth Gledhill, the assistant editor at The Tablet. That's the leading international Catholic journal. She's also the former religious affairs correspondent at The Times. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Just want to start by asking you how you think the 266th Pope, the first Latin American pontiff, is going to be remembered.
I think he'll be remembered for his legacies in the areas of the environment. Early on, he produced this encyclical Laudato Si, which has had a really dramatic influence on parishes, on people's activism, on environmental issues, and on the wider world beyond the church as well. And he did establish himself very early on in his papacy as a leading prominent voice on arguing for the current global warming situation to be addressed. But more recently, he's become very known for being very outspoken on issues around poverty, around refugees and migrants, and around war, conflict. And admittedly, previous popes have been outspoken in these areas too. After all, it's very much in alignment with the Christian gospel to speak about poverty and the poor and the rich and on issues like that. However, I think Pope Francis has made a particular impact because of his skillful use and his team's skillful use of the modern media and the opportunities represented by social media and other modern media to really get the message out there. And he's really used that to great effect. The other thing he'll be remembered more to do with internal church governance is his trying to grasp the issues of Vatican reform, especially around the areas of finance, which he did pretty effectively. And then the area of sex abuse of paedophile priests. And some of his critics would say that he could have been more effective on that, but he did really try very hard to do his best on that and did change the culture of the church, or certainly began to change it to one where more openness and more honesty now does exist around that area, but there's still a long way to go. He also introduced this concept, or reintroduced it if you count the very early church, this concept of synodality. That was an attempt really to try and make real in today's church the reforms of the Second Vatican Council, which I think he really wanted the modern church to be a post-Vatican II church. And that runs counter to the views of some traditionalists who I think might even like it to be pre-Vatican II church, or at least not to be too much modernized. You know, they want to return to the Latin Mass and that kind of thing. So again, that has proved popular in parts of the church and not so popular in other parts of the church. So I think his successor, well, one of the things Pope Francis was, he was an elderly man when he was appointed Pope. And he was a man in a hurry because he never thought, I think, that he would last as long as he did. He had more years than perhaps he thought at the start of his papacy. And so he used that time to good effect, but he was always trying to do so much, trying to get so much done.
Sure.
And
I just want to interrupt you. I just want to interrupt you there, Ruth, because you make a really interesting point, and you made that point right at the beginning as well, where you said that as he sort of eased into the job of being the Pope, he started being a bit more outspoken. And I'm just wondering whether you think, and this ties in with what you were saying there about him being elderly and living longer than he thought he probably would, whether popes tend to get a bit more audacious, a little bit more daring in terms of stepping over the established lines to take on issues as they get more senior in the role?
well, I don't know really. I mean, I think with Pope John Paul II, his predecessor but one, you know, he was the Pope for such a long time. I mean, one former editor of the tablet, John Wilkins, never had a conclave in his whole time as editor, because Pope John Paul II was editor for so long. And then in the last few years, you know, we're having we've had Benedict and now Francis, and so I think that from the short time of experience, I might suggest it normally goes in the opposite direction. Popes become a bit more conservative as they get older. Certainly Benedict, when he was a younger man and was at the Second Vatican Council, you know, he seemed to be quite liberal on many fronts, but maybe it was the experience of the council, or some people say it was the experience of the riots in Paris in the 60s. Anyways, he became much more conservative as he got older, and he was quite a conservative pope in the end. And actually Francis, when he started out, he made some quite radical sounding comments. So, for example, on the gay issue, he was the first pope ever to use the word gay. You know, most popes would not have used the word gay at all. And he said, "Who am I to judge?" famously, when he was on the plane on the way back from his first foreign trip. And he said, if gay men come to God with love in their hearts, who am I to judge?
So you're making it sound, sorry to cut you off. I mean, you're making it sound like, Pope Francis set a very different tone for the papacy from his predecessors. Is that a fair comment?
Well, I think that is a very fair comment. And you've hit the right word there, tone. So he didn't change much, if anything, theologically. But he did change the church's tone. And I think that was a really significant change, and one that would be really interesting to see if his successor continues through with that. So, for example, Pope Francis decided not to live in the traditional papal apartments, but instead in the Santa Marta residence, the Vatican guest house. Will his successor live there, or will he return to the papal apartments? Because whatever he does, he'll be sending out a message, won't he? And then likewise with the clothes the Pope wears, will he, like Pope Francis, eschew the red shoes and the white trousers and some of the finery that's been associated with popes over the decades and centuries? Or will he just insist on the simple white that Pope Francis insisted on right from the very start? So I think there's a number of challenges facing his successor, because whatever he does, it's bound to be interpreted,
Sure.
to the ends of the earth.
Sure, and let's talk a little bit about who that successor might be. But before we do that, let's talk about what happens next, because obviously the funeral is set for Saturday. Then there's the conclave. I mean, what's your hunch? I mean, how long do you think we could be looking at? I know it's impossible to answer, but I mean, do you think there are some obvious candidates waiting in the wings?
Well, the bookies' favourite one of the bookies' favourites is Cardinal Tagle of the Philippines. And he's someone who's seen as being kind of very much in the image of Pope Francis in many respects. Some say he's fallen out of favour more recently, but I think he's still a favourite. Then Cardinal Parolin is another favourite. And then Cardinal Robert Serra, even maybe, who's been around, who's quite an elderly one, who's been around and been mentioned in previous conclaves. And then, we've even got Arthur Roche, who's from England, who's over in the Vatican at one of the dicasteries. And he, again, could be seen as possible favourite, although he hasn't really been mentioned by the bookies. But he's the one English one, I think, name might come up from time to time. And so the successors, the potential successors, people being talked about, range from conservative to much more in the mould of Pope Francis. He has rather appointed a lot of cardinals. So the college has a lot of people appointed by Pope Francis. Only the under 80s can vote. Only the under 80s are in the college. So I think that there is a strong chance that his successor will be somebody who is in a similar mould, but maybe someone who might take things a little more slowly, or might try and have a period of stability. It's not that Pope Francis was, led an unstable church, but I think people did feel that he was trying to change a lot of things, even if it, in the tone and the manner of the church is the way it was perceived.
Okay.
Even just the way he appointed cardinals, it was, everything he kind of tried to make more informal and to take some of the pomp and the labyrinths in bureaucracy away from it. So I think his successor might very likely try and bring what is perceived as stability back into the equation.
Sure.
But how conservative he will be, I just don't know, because I'm just not sure how much support there is left in the college for a very conservative cardinal now.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the cardinals that Pope Francis appointed. There were cardinals from Tonga, Haiti, Mongolia. So, it really seems like he created a much more inclusive church, internationally speaking at any rate, during his decade or so in that role. But just to wrap up, we're talking about a 2,000-year-old institution here. Are you seeing its influence, or do you think it's fair to say its influence is declining, or do you think its influence is growing?
Well, in my view, its influence is growing, and certainly it's growing in importance. And I think particularly at the moment, it's difficult to say for sure, actually, to answer that question either one way or the other for sure at the moment, because of, what's happening in the world at the moment, the wider world. And with what's happening in the United States and in other countries where there's this resurgence of a particular kind of right-wing politics, Pope Francis was very much a voice on the left. I mean, he was coming from the Christian gospel, obviously, but in political terms, he was interpreted often as being on the left side of the political equation. And I think many people would feel that his was a voice in such a prominent position that was needed at this time. So I think the world it'll be a loss that he's not with us anymore. And the church will feel that loss. And I think a successor will need to be able to work within this kind of current political, very complex and unpredictable and, in some respects slightly frightening political situation internationally, to bring some stability. That's why I think they might go for someone who is capable of bringing stability both to within the church and maybe of impacting a stability beyond the church in the wider world as well.
And just lastly, I mean, one of Pope Francis' last public engagements on Easter Sunday was to meet with the US Vice President J.D. Vance. It was a brief meeting. Do you think the two men managed to see eye to eye?
Well, certainly both men, including J.D. Vance, are very committed Catholics. Pope Francis was a very committed Catholic, obviously, and so the fundamentals of their faith are the same. And J.D. Vance, for whether one agrees with him politically or not, his faith is, he's a devout man, and they have that much in common. So I think that there would have been a meeting, certainly of spirits.
Okay. Well, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. We really appreciate it. Ruth Gledhill, Assistant Editor of The Tablet. Thank you very much indeed. Well, that is all we have time for today's edition of Global News Today. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. We look forward to seeing you again tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, bye-bye.